There's something else. It's always instructive as a student to pay attention to what's missing, not only what's there. There are some very conspicuous events in history that are not mentioned in the New Testament. For one, Nero's persecutions after 64 AD. Nero, see, up till then, most of the persecutions of the Christians came from the Jewish community by zealous Jews. In fact, one of the points that Luke makes, not only in his gospel, but also in the book of Acts, that's why we believe, many of us suspect, that the Luke, volume 1 and volume 2, were the necessary documentation for an appeal to Caesar. We know from the Roman laws that if you appeal to Caesar, the facts surrounding your background had to precede you to Rome. In those days, that was an expensive project because they didn't have printing and copying. Putting a document together was an expensive process. But you notice, if you read Luke carefully, the centurions are always good guys. And he goes out to some lengths to point out that the uprisings that occurred wherever Paul went were by the Jewish community, not persecuted by Rome. That was a development that came with Nero and following, the persecutions by Rome. Well, it's interesting. That started in 64 AD. No mention of that. The execution of the leader of the Jerusalem church, James, who led the council in Acts 15. He gets executed in 62 AD. That's well documented. It's interesting that's not alluded to in any of the New Testament documents. What does this tell you? That the New Testament documents were completed before these things happened. This is a way of putting an early dating on the document, especially when some of these things would have been incorporated in their arguments. The Jewish revolt against the Romans in 66 AD, no mention. The destruction of the temple is the most telling one of all in 70 AD, the fact that that's not mentioned. So this is strong documentation demonstrating that the documents that make up the New Testament were drafted and in circulation prior to any of these events. In other words, they were circulated prior to 62 AD. And we'll get to more of that. Now, there is a parchment. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Dead Sea stuff and all that, but there is a parchment. It was published for a while under the label of the Jesus Papyri. That's just a secular label for a book that was written about it. But there was some scraps, a little segment of text of Matthew's Gospel. And it had been found in Egypt, and it was at the Magdalen School of Oxford. And there are 3 fragments. They're written on both sides, which tells you that this was a codex. The ancient Old Testament was written on scrolls. That's why I always use the little idiom of scrolls. When I talk Old Testament, I use a little scrap of parchment. As we go through these slides, I use a different background so you make you conscious of what came from the Old and New Testament. A codex started to emerge when they discovered it was useful to write on parchment on both sides and make pages like in a book. A codex is what you and I think of as a book, in contrast to a scroll, which has, a scroll has two rolls, and a scroll is a scroll. Okay, codexes are handy because you got pages you can quickly get at page 237. You don't have to wind through a scroll. So codexes started to emerge in this period about the time of the first church. And it's interesting that this is already, the fact that these scraps are written on both sides indicate they were a codex, not in a scroll. And there's 3 fragments written on both sides. There's about a total of 24 lines. They appear to be a segment of Matthew chapter 26, verses 23 on one side, 31 on the other. Something else that'll be important as we get a little further, they also conform to what we understand from Textus Receptus, and I'll come to that later in a minute here. But some advanced technology comes to our rescue. And it turns out that a scanning laser microscope can differentiate between 20 millionths of a meter layers of the papyrus. They can measure the height and depth of the ink as well as the angle of the stylus. They can tell whether the writer was right or left-handed. See, the technology today is astonishing. Well, using these advanced technologies, it turns out that Dr. Karsten Thiede, using a scanner laser microscope and comparing with 4 other manuscripts, and I won't go through the details of the other 4 manuscripts. The more important thing, what he's done from his studies, he's concluded that the Magdalen Papyrus is either an original of Matthew's gospel or an immediate copy. It was written while Matthew and the other disciples and other eyewitnesses were still alive. The point I'm making is you will find in your Bible helps many estimates of when certain books are dated, but you'll discover if you do your homework that the current scholarship is substantiating the dates far earlier than was previously believed. Many people are under the impression that the New Testament was put together in the 2nd century AD and so forth. That's nonsense. We're discovering that many of these things are contemporaneous. They were circulated before 60 AD, and some of these are dated in the 50s.